Right here at the entrance to the Cedar Hill Cemetery lies an unassuming gravestone that belongs to a Corydon man whose actions triggered events that by many accounts almost started the Civil War a little early. A story that is so filled with skullduggery, shootouts, kidnapping, a jailbreak, and cannons that it almost defies belief. The man's name is Oswell Wright, a black man and freed slave who, with the Bell family, risked their lives to help slaves escape to freedom. Oswell and the Bells were part of the Underground Railroad and helped many slaves escape the South through Harrison County. But this was also a time when the Fugitive Slave Act was aggressively enforced, forcing citizens to help return slaves and made it a crime to assist or even entice their escape. Now Oswell Wright was a slave owned by the Wright family and inherited by Elizabeth Wright, who became the wife of David Bell. Moving from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania and eventually to southern Indiana, Oswell became free when slavery was outlawed in these states. But Oswell was like a member of the family and fond of the Bells, and stayed and worked with them as they moved ever westward. Eventually, the Bells bought land right here, once owned by the Boones, and started farming near Mockport, Indiana, across the river from Brandenburg, Kentucky. Trade and travel were very important across the river, and realizing this, David Bell seized the opportunity and bought a ferry boat, and along with it the license to run it across the Ohio River. The Bells had 7 children with 3 boys, John being the oldest, Horace and Charles the youngest. When John and Horace were older, they headed off to California with so many other Americans to grab their fortunes in the California gold rush, leaving Charles and Oswell home to help David Bell run the farm and the ferry. Now, with those relationships established, we'll get on with the more exciting part of the story. In 1857, there lived here in Brandenburg, Kentucky, a slave named Charles, who was owned by a Dr. C.H. Ditto, who had a wife named Mary Ann, belonging to a Brandenburg merchant. Now, Charles was a highly skilled blacksmith and was very trusted by Dr. Ditto. Dr. Ditto allowed him to cross the river to fish and shoe horses in Indiana when he needed. On September 26, Charles Bell, now 17, was seen with Charles Ditto in his blacksmith shop. Bell then headed across the river, and Ditto made it known to many that since it was Sunday, he was going across the river to go fishing. On Monday, there was no sight of him, and he was presumed to be a runaway. Charles Bell was immediately suspected as an accomplice since he was seen with Charles Ditto and known to be a fiery abolitionist. Once it was clear Charles Ditto escaped, notices were sent throughout the southern Indiana area that there was a reward for information and capture of the escaped slave and accomplices. Brownstown, Indiana was a frequented spot for escaped slaves because from there they were able to board trains heading north to Canada. Living in Brownstown was a Mrs. Withers, who told authorities of a free Negro named Oswell Wright from Corydon, who came to her house asking for food for himself and a fleeing enslaved man named Charles. After she gave them breakfast, Wright took the fugitive to the train and saw him off on his way to Canada. She also told of a family named Bell, who lived on the Indiana shore of the Ohio River, who were now planning the escape of Ditto's enslaved wife, Mary Ann. Also from Brownstown, there was a Mr. Johnson, who heard the story. Seeing the reward, he came here to Corydon to prevent Oswell Wright. Oswell, over time, eventually retold the story to Johnson, verifying Withers' story. Then Johnson started to organize a group of men and plotted to capture Oswell, Charles, and David Bell and send them to Kentucky. A fake escape was set up to lure Charles here to the Kentucky side of the river, and it was here that they then arrested him. The men then rowed across the river to the Bell House, and upon entering found Oswell Wright and arrested him. Telling David Bell he needed to cross the river to collect his horses, Mr. Bell went along, and once on the river on Kentucky waters, they arrested him as accomplice as well. Now, after 160 some odd years, no one's exactly sure where the Brandenburg jail was at the time in the 1850s, but it is believed to have been on this rise, which would have been at the south end of the town square, which no longer exists. Now, the Bells were taken here and placed on a $5,000 bond each, and Oswell on $3,000 on the 25th of November, 1857. Not able to make bond, they would stay here until the court met in May. People in Harrison and Floyd counties were furious because of what they saw as an illegal arrest of Indiana citizens and an illegal extradition out of the state to Kentucky. An armed band of neighbors from Corydon, Mockport, and New Albany got together and made plans to free the prisoners, but problems with their boats foiled their mission. On the Kentucky side, hearing rumors of armed Hoosiers invading their town, the people of Brandenburg armed themselves and had the Meade County Rangers sent by order of the Kentucky governor to defend the town and guard the jail. Fortunately, the Hoosiers didn't come, so no violence ensued, and the Kentucky Guard grew too strong to break the prisoners out of jail. They lingered in jail for months. News of the arrest and confinement finally reached Horace and John Bell in California, and they returned to Indiana as fast as they could. Now, Horace had gained a bit of a reputation out west of being a guy you wouldn't want to mess with. He was part of the original Los Angeles Rangers, tracking down and arresting violent outlaws in Southern California, dead or alive. The Rangers were responsible for putting an end to the outlaws Joaquin Murrieta and Three-Fingered Jack during a shootout that ended their lives. Since the distance to collect the reward was too great to bring their whole bodies in to collect the reward, they cut the head off Murrieta and placed it in a glass jar of alcohol and turned it in for the reward. Now, Three-Fingered Jack's head was disfigured with gunshot wounds, so they cut off his three-fingered hand, placed it in alcohol, and turned it in for the reward. Although Horace wasn't in on the action, he participated in tracking down these two outlaws and many others. He had also earned a reputation as a fierce soldier, earning the rank of major in a failed military takeover in Nicaragua. The citizens of Brandenburg had heard some of these stories and were concerned about what he might do when he came to their town. Upon returning to Corydon, Horace Bell consulted his friend and lawyer Walter Q. Gresham, who lived on this site, just about 100 yards from Indiana's Constitutional, which under its broad limbs, the Constitution of Indiana was signed. Gresham, by the way, later became a major general in the Civil War, a federal judge, Secretary of the Treasury, and Secretary of State under President Chester A. Arthur. Now, Horace was determined to settle this matter legally, despite friends who wanted to free the detainees by force. And with Gresham's help, Horace attempted to get them out on bail, but the Southerners refused. It was now May, and the trial finally started here in this building, what used to be the Brandenburg Courthouse, now a private home. The bells were jeered in the streets by the people of Brandenburg, and tempers became inflamed as angry Hoosiers were present for their support. Horace calmed down the crowds that wanted to fight. Now, one day after court was adjourned for the day, a crowd followed the Bell brothers to their hotel, whereupon Horace made a short speech to the town folks declaring, "I don't want border warfare, only justice. But if they don't get justice, I will come in alone with my brother, break the jail, and free the prisoners in broad daylight." The Kentuckians took it as a joke, saying a man who talked that big would attempt nothing. Delay was a strategy of the court, and when preliminaries were over and the prosecution was asked if they were ready to proceed, they said no and asked for a 6-month delay, which was granted. With the Bells in jail already for 7 months, this was more than Horace and John Bell could stand. John and Horace Bell left word that they were returning to California, but instead disappeared in southern Indiana, and after a few weeks the Kentucky governor removed the troops and 200 Minutemen were sworn in to protect the jail and town. Now that the tension subsided, the two brothers, with their mother's urging, planned the jailbreak. After being rowed across the river, the two men separated and approached the jail from different directions to decrease attention. Horace arrived first, and upon entering, found the jailer, his wife, and 2 guards eating dinner. Pointing his revolvers at their heads, he drove them into a corner of the room. But one of the guards jumped out a window to sound the alarm. John now arrived, and grabbing the keys, ran upstairs and freed their father and brother and armed them both. Then they locked the jailer and his wife and the remaining guard in the cell. John then led Charles and David Bell down the steps to make their escape. Unfortunately, they found that Oswell was being held somewhere else, so they were unable to free him with the others. Since the escape guard sounded the alarm, Horace went in front of the courthouse and held back the Minutemen trying to get the guns to stop the escape. Once the whole party was at the river, he ran from the courthouse and down the hill to make his own escape. As the Bells descended down the levee and crossed the river, shooting was exchanged between the militia and the Bells, but shooting down at such a distance, all the shots missed, and there were no injuries on either side. Now north of the Ohio River, Horace Bell was lauded as a hero, newspapers calling him a brave and daring deliverer of justice. One newspaper published a poem they had a local poet compose to celebrate him. But on the south side of the river, this was a different story. Horace Bell was a vile and wanted criminal. A $500 reward was offered for his capture and transport back to Kentucky to face justice. On October 23rd, the Floyd County Fair in New Albany was celebrating its last day. Many people from all over southern Indiana and northern Kentucky attended the fair, and Mrs. Bell and a daughter were there and crossed over to Louisville for a visit. Horace accompanied them to the Duck Wall Ferry and saw them off. Horace then, walking up the street, stopped and chatted with friends at the DePauw House, as in DePauw University. He then decided to get on a stagecoach and return to Corydon, but on his way, when he reached the corner of Main and Bank Streets, in front of this bank somewhere, he was suddenly surrounded by 5 Kentucky detectives with guns, better known today as bounty hunters. They quickly disarmed him and hustled him down to the wharf. At first, he was placed in the Louisville jail, but later, under heavy guard, taken to the Brandenburg jail. Again, New Albany and the surrounding Indiana area was furious. At once, men started to arm for their rescue. About 75 men procured the ferry boat Adelaide and, placing a cannon on it, headed for Brandenburg. Having heard of the approaching posse, Horace was moved to Big Spring, about 20 miles south of the river. The Adelaide arrived off the shore of Brandenburg and anchored, and with the threat of firing their cannon, demanded that Horace be released. Citizens of Brandenburg, fearing a mob of invaders, met with the Hoosiers and formed a committee to settle the affair peacefully. A deal was worked out that Horace would plead guilty to the jailbreak and the governor of Kentucky would pardon him. With this done, he was released, and he was hailed as a hero in Indiana. A play was even written and performed, portraying his heroism and gallantry. Horace then returned to California, only to return to Indiana again to fight in the Civil War as a scout. Then the Bell family soon moved west again, this time to Missouri. So, what was the fate of our friend Oswell Wright? He was convicted in May of 1859 of aiding the escape of a slave and sentenced to prison. He completed his sentence in prison and was released in June of 1864. He returned to Corydon and died here on March 31st, 1875, at about the age of 64. Much of this story was taken from the book Fortune Favors the Brave, a biography of Horace Bell, written by Benjamin S. Harrison from Redlands, California, published in 1953.